Hello, writers, and welcome to the Researchers Writing Podcast. This podcast is for all your researchers in the sciences who want to write papers in a structured and time-efficient way so you can get published in top-tier journals at a calm and steady pace. In this podcast, we talk about how we can write papers that are clear, concise, and compelling, and how to make the process of writing less hard. My name is Dr. Anna Clemens, and I am an academic writing coach with a PhD in chemistry. In the Researchers Writing Academy, my online program, I've helped hundreds of researchers get their papers published in their target journals using a streamlined writing process. If you want to succeed in your academic career, mentor your students effectively, and have your research make an impact in the world, you are in the right place. Let's get into it. Hello again, writers. Well, thank you so much for tuning in again to the Researchers Writing Podcast. I hope you're all well. We'll be talking about AI today, or generative AI more precisely. And that's, of course, well, ChatGPT is probably the most popular one. But there are vast abundance of apps now based on this technology. And some are even designed specifically for science and research. I've come across a lot, honestly. I don't know, there's things like Side, Mirror Thing, Julius, AvidNote, to just name a few that I've come across recently. Um, Really, a lot has happened on this front in the last like 1 to 2 years. And for a lot of academics, workflows have changed when it comes to writing and research. Now, I want to start with a bit of a definition first, so we all know what we're talking about. Generative AI means generative artificial intelligence, and that uses so-called large language models. They're also abbreviated LLMs to produce text. Now, LLMs are neural networks that have been trained on vast amount of text that they can process. We can ask a question and we get as much text produced in the matter of seconds as we want. And there are a lot of questions that I hear researchers ask about generative AI. There's a lot of confusion. So I've heard researchers ask, well, shall I use generative AI for writing and research at all? And if, like, which tasks exactly can I use it for? And which programs should I use? Like, there's so many, right? But also regarding more the like ethical side of things. Like, firstly, is it allowed? Like, do journals allow you to, well, use generative AI to write a scientific paper or help you in the process of writing it? And if even if it's allowed, like, is it like ethical to use it? And in this episode, I want to give you my view on using generative AI for writing scientific papers. Um, I'm planning to analyze some of the hopes and expectations we have. So, kind of the goals that we want to achieve using generative AI. And I am probably a bit more on the skeptical side than a lot of other people who talk about generative AI and science and research on the internet. So, be prepared for maybe some other views than what you have generally heard. Maybe I have a bit of a hot take on what I think we should actually invest our time in as scientists and researchers. And I'm also will give you 8 specific recommendations for how to use generative AI in your writing and in your research. All right, let's start with our hopes and goals. The first goal that I commonly see is that we want generative AI to save us time. We want to use it so it can write a paper faster, so it can shorten text faster. We want it to assist us when we read papers, when we do literature reviews. We want it to provide summaries of these papers so that we don't have to read quite as much, for example. The second hope and goal that I see is where we wanted to increase the quality of our writing. We wanted to be able to spot mistakes. We wanted to be able to suggest better phrases. And that's especially true, I think, for non-native speakers, from what I hear. Um, they are often loving generative AI for this. Um, Also making our writing flow better, and also in the literature search, like finding papers that we maybe have overlooked just because there's such a vast amount of papers. Nowadays, it's easy to miss some. So using generative AI, well, the hope is that we will find better papers. All right. Also, I think the third kind of hope is we want for generative AI to enhance our own creativity. Well, what do I mean by that? I mean, well, we kind of think, well, could it maybe help us connect our research or connect different areas of research together, different papers, things like that, identify gaps in knowledge even, identify research opportunities that we may have missed with our like human brain, right? So and also what I've heard people use it for is to act as kind of thought partners, like sparring partners, to potentially spark ideas. Almost like talking to a real person, having a discussion with another scientist, you're using generative AI to facilitate that discussion to help our brains perform better. All right, so quick recap. We hope for generative AI to save us time, to increase the quality of our writing and maybe research, and to enhance our creativity. Now, I want to examine each of those goals and hopes one after the other. So, firstly, saving time. Okay, so again, the hope is it's faster to produce the text for me. It helps me edit my paper, and maybe it provides me summaries of papers so that the literature review is a lot faster. Well, whenever I have personally used generative AI, and I've only used ChatGPT so far, and when I've used it to help me write something, and that admittedly has not been for any scientific papers, not any part of a scientific paper I've ever used ChatGPT for. I've used it to write marketing material mainly because I thought, well, that's maybe a good use for it. So I can spend more time doing my actual work, and so I can spend less time marketing. Um, well, my conclusion was that it actually took me more time using it versus just writing the marketing material myself. Um, I have learned that in order to get good results from generative AI, you need to give it a lot of context, or I needed to give it a lot of context of what I was writing about, and how I wanted it to be written, etc. It also ended up being quite the iterative process. I kind of needed to go in and tell it what I liked about the suggestions, which like bits of text I like and what I didn't like, um, and kind of refine the writing that I got iteratively like that. And that took a lot of time. Um, Also, as far as I understand, anything you do teach it that way, it will actually forget again after a few days. That's apparently an inbuilt security feature. I haven't verified this, but this is what I've been told. So my sort of recommendation here is try to be self-critical about whether you're actually spending less or more time when using generative AI. I think many of us like using generative AI more than sitting down alone with our brain to do the writing. Because of course it feels easier to like chat with someone than trying to like just tease something out of our brain when we're all alone. Um, and I want you to ask yourself, are you perhaps sometimes using AI to avoid deep work? I just want you to be very aware of this. I want you to self-reflect on this. And I'm not saying that AI can never save you time. Um, I bet it can. I bet it can. But I just want you to be careful and actually, well, maybe measure, maybe start a timer. Like I keep recommending Toggle is like a time I recommend using for when you do different tasks. within the writing process, just so you know how long each step takes you. And when you use a timer like that, like toggle or two, like toggle, you can determine really quickly, well, is it quicker when I use ChatGPT or another generative AI or when I do it myself? Also, I'm kind of asking the question on a bit more philosophical level. Well, is faster really the goal? Is writing a paper faster really the goal? Or should the goal be to publish better papers? Like, do we really need to publish more papers or do we need to publish better papers? And I know I'm very well aware of the pressures in the current academic environment to publish a lot. So that's not an individual critique of anyone. This is more a philosophical question I'm asking on a societal level. I'm just putting it out there. All right. Second hope slash goal. Um, increasing quality. So we want generative AI to improve the quality of our writing, make the English better, make our papers, make the writing in our papers more clear, more concise, more compelling. What do I think about that hope? Does generative AI fulfill that hope? Well, generative AI doesn't inherently know what good scientific writing is. Do keep that in mind. Generative AI is being trained on some of the literature that's out there. Um, and a lot of the papers out there are not written well, are not well written. And that's the training material that you get. That's what the outputs you get are trained on. Um, and actually, that ties in a bit with a mission with my business, with the Researchers Writing Academy, because one of our big missions is to increase the quality of the scientific literature so that researchers and also others, journalists, the public, can actually understand what's being communicated. And that doesn't mean dumbing down, but the exact mission of my business is to increase the quality of papers so that they are more clear, concise, and compelling. And I think often what generative AI writes does sound kind of good at first glance. Like, may have some phrases that you haven't seen before. You're like, ooh, that sounds like good. But I often find it, as I dig deeper, I find it often hollow and repetitive. Um, and it often doesn't actually follow what I think are the core concepts of clear, concise, and compelling academic writing. Also, side note, regarding summaries, I mentioned earlier that some researchers like to use generative AI to produce summaries of papers in the body of the scientific literature. And these summaries you get often are good, like they actually are summaries of the paper. But I just want you to be careful because the summaries may not actually summarize what is important in that paper to you. Like, what is important about that paper in relation to your own work? Like, what in that paper do you actually care about? Because there is no such thing as an objective summary. Like, a first pass through, in order for you to decide, oh, is this worth reading or not, having generative AI give you a summary certainly can be helpful, even though I argue that's what the abstract should be for. Um, if abstracts were better, or if the quality of abstract generally was better in the scientific literature, would we even need generative AI to give us a summary? I don't know. Maybe we would still need it. But yeah, so as a first pass, fine. But if you use generative AI to create summaries, literature summaries, like literature notes that you kind of save in your literature database, so you can more easily like find papers that you've read again, I don't think it's suitable for that because I do think for that to happen, you do need to extract yourself what in that paper is important to you. Also, generative AI does, of course, not know, or not, of course, it doesn't know what is correct and what isn't. Generative AI can produce wrong results. So if your English isn't good enough, or if you don't have good enough writing skills, academic writing skills specifically, to judge whether the text that generative AI produces for you is good, like actually does adhere to the concepts of clear, concise, compelling writing, well, then there's no point using it, in my opinion. In my opinion, it even becomes risky because when you don't know if the output is good, if you can't judge the quality, then you really shouldn't be using it. Because when you publish something that has been produced with AI, you are liable for it. We cannot put AI as the author in a paper. You are responsible for the content. You, as the author, are responsible for the content in the paper. And with regards to literature research, I think there are some really big drawbacks of generative AI that I want you to be aware of. First of all, it may introduce citation bias because it cannot access all papers. Like when papers are behind paywalls, when publishers haven't agreed to provide papers or books, scientific content and books, etc. It means that, you never get like a complete literature search when you use generative AI. Also, citation bias comes because, or gets introduced because generative AI cannot distinguish between good and bad research. To generative AI, every paper weighs equal, and that's regardless of sample size or quality. It also cannot analyze scientific papers critically. So claim, when an author's claims do not match with what the data that they're actually showing provides, if they just make a claim that isn't backed up by the data, well, ChatGPT or generative AI will just tell you that claim as a fact. And actually, it's even been shown that ChatGPT does produce made-up references. I'm not sure if that's true for all generative AI tools, but that's definitely something I think to be hyper aware of. Also, these models have always been trained a few years ago. So the results that you get, the text that you get, will always be slightly outdated, depending on when the tool that you're using has been updated last. Okay, that's what I had to say about the second point, increasing quality. Now I want to talk more about increasing creativity. The hope there, just to recap, was we want generative AI to kind of act as a thought partner, to spark ideas, to identify gaps in knowledge, identify research opportunities that we, with our human brain, with our limited human brain, may have missed. And I have a use case for, enhancing creativity, a personal one as well for this, which is for naming things. And this is something we also do in a scientific context, right? We often want to name, I don't know, systems, model systems, theories, processes, anything we have invented. We often want to find a good, like, catchy name for them, right? Or an acronym or something like that. And so I have used ChatGPT for that, and it's been really fun. I really thought it was a fun process, and it really sparked ideas. So it really helped me actually be more creative, because I noticed that I'm just not very good at coming up with names myself. This was always one of my struggles, and I like ChatGPT specifically for that. But I also have to say, I've never actually ended up using a name that it has suggested, but it did sort of give me that spark so I could then come up with a name that I thought was like the perfect one. But I also, so here's the bad about the creative aspect. Because generative AI is not creative in the actual meaning of the word, which means it cannot come up with new thoughts and connections just based on how it is inherently built. That means generative AI cannot identify gaps in knowledge. It can only provide the data that it has been fed with. In other words, generative AI is only capable of convergent thinking, convergent creativity, which means familiar solutions, finding familiar solutions to problems. It is not capable of divergent thinking, which are those out of the box ideas. And my kind of recommendation, my overall recommendation for this expectation of increasing your own creativity or using generative AI to increase your own creativity is that I strongly would discourage you from outsourcing the like thinking part of writing, the thinking part of thinking about your data, thinking about your research to AI. And these are tasks to me like identifying the story you're telling in your paper, identifying research gaps, coming up with research questions. I think these are all things I want you to use your own brain for. Because thinking about science is your unique skill as a researcher, as a scientist, as an academic. I think it's really, really important and it will pay off so much if you sharpen and develop this skill. It will pay off for you personally because you will become better being a scientist, you will become a better researcher. But also, it will just advance science so much more if not every scientist suddenly starts relying on generative AI, which by definition relies on knowledge that has already been there. Um, we need to use our science brains to innovate. I want us all to remember this is your profession. If you're a researcher, if you're a scientist, this is your profession. This is why you went into science to think, to solve problems. You have this unique core skill, and seriously, our society needs that, needs people who do sharpen, who do develop that skill. I now also wanted to leave you with 8 specific recommendations, 8 points I think that are worth being aware of as you use generative AI. Um, the whole point of this episode isn't to say, oh, you shouldn't use generative AI, even if maybe I'm more critical than most people. Or that's my feeling. I don't know if that's even true. I think there's a lot of other people who are critical as well. But I want you to use it, but I want you to be using it wisely. Do you not know where to start writing papers and how to make your papers engaging? So much so that you procrastinate and even experience writer's block? Well, take a deep breath because I got you. I developed a whole system that crafts a compelling story for your paper that makes the writing process more structured, which makes it really way more effortless to write the paper without procrastination. Because as you're going through the writing process, you just always know what the next step is. Just type researcherswritingpodcast.com/free in your browser and I'll explain each step in a free training video. It's researcherswritingpodcast.com/free. Okay, let's get back to the episode. All right. So, recommendation time. Recommendation number 1. I strongly encourage you to use generative AI as your assistant. Be in the driver's seat as the author and have generative AI be your assistant that helps you with tasks. That means, for example, never just copy text that you cannot appraise the quality of. We want you to be able to judge the quality of a text, even if you use generative AI to produce text, to shorten text. You are the one who then goes through and judges that text. And maybe you get inspiration for, oh, yeah, this is the way you could write things. But it doesn't actually fit here. But next time, thanks so much. I've learned something. This is how you could write it. Like this, I think, is a good use, but just asking ChatGPT to write something or another tool to write something for you and then just blindly copy paste it is not the right way. Okay, second recommendation. Do analyze critically whether AI is saving you time when you're using it. I do think this iterative refining of the generative AI output that I mentioned earlier may in some cases actually take longer than actually doing the task yourself. And I think maybe be less satisfying. I mean, it's maybe easier, but maybe it's also less satisfying. Um, and on that note, my third recommendation, do self-reflect on whether you're using or when you're using generative AI to avoid deep work. I've been there. I'm just saying this because I have noticed this with myself, and I think this is just something to be aware of. Okay, recommendation number four. Um, for literature reviews specifically, I recommend using generative AI as a complementary tool. So I think it's great if you use it to identify literature you may have missed using more conventional tools, but I strongly discourage you from only relying on generative AI. Okay, recommendation number five. Um, do outsource time-consuming tasks to generative AI or AI tools in general. Um, those tasks I think that you don't need your scientist brain for. And that I think is like correcting spelling, correcting grammar, formatting. Like, please, can someone invent a generative AI tool that just auto formats an article according to the specifications of a specific journal? Like, that I think would be an amazing use of generative AI, because this is such an annoying task. Um, and such a time-consuming task that just takes energy that like I cannot believe like scientists have to spend their energy and time on reformatting papers so that journals accept them or that journals even consider them. So yeah, those types of tasks, I think, oh, that would be amazing if generative AI could help us with. And yeah, do use them whenever you find tools that actually help you with that, saving time. Also, recommendation number six now, always check your target journal's guidelines on whether they permit you using generative AI during the writing process. Those guidelines are changing fast, so you need to kind of keep up to date as you're writing your paper. Okay, recommendation number seven. Make sure that the tool you're using, or that you know that what the tool you're using is going to do with your inputs. Um, because some tools actually save your data that you put in, may save the text you put in, or some may even put like scientific data in, raw data that you acquired. Um, and you just may want to check before making anything potentially confidential, potentially become a public resource. Like check if they save them, check what they do with the data. Okay, on to my last recommendation, number eight. Um, if you struggle with academic writing, with scientific writing, do invest in learning that skill. This is simply an investment into your own career that I've said it before, but it will pay off. It will pay off so much. You invest time once and then you have that skill forever. Um, we don't know what's going to happen to generative AI. Um, it may go away. I don't know. Some things may happen with it. It may get banned. I don't know. Will it get banned? I don't know. But you keep that skill forever. You don't have to rely on anything else. You know your own brain. You can write a paper that gets published. You can write a paper in a like certain amount of time that you feel good with. And that's a really, I think, important skill to have. Yeah, wow. Okay. These are my thoughts on generative AI. I'd be curious to know if anything of this resonated with you. I'm curious if you have like a different opinion. That's of course totally fine. I want to say like I may change my opinion on this. Like this field is evolving rapidly. This is just what I'm thinking about generative AI right now. Like we will see. We will see. It's an exciting field, and yeah, looking forward to hearing your experiences as well. Um, Generative AI has been such a popular topic in the Researchers Writing Academy among members, and we already facilitated two group discussions on it, where kind of members learn from each other and like suggested tools and use cases to each other. So yeah, I'm looking forward to the discussion. All right, let us get to our second part in the podcast, and that's, of course, our listener question. And today's listener question is, should I send a pre-submission inquiry to the journal editor before submitting my article? This question comes from Sarah. Thank you so much, Sarah, for submitting it. And actually, it's funny you asked this because this is a question that I mean, I recently also answered on one of our group coaching calls, and I think I've answered this question already a few times since I have the Researchers Writing Academy. It definitely is one that I think a lot of listeners might also have thought about at one point or the other, or maybe you're just currently asking yourself that question. Um, Okay, a pre-submission inquiry, that's a bit like a cover letter to a journal editor. But you don't submit that with your whole paper as you submit your paper, but you basically just ask the journal editor in a pre-submission inquiry, um, hey, this is what I'm writing, this is what my study is about. Could this be a good fit for your journal? And some journals have forms for that on their website. Um, and some, well, don't have a specific form for that on their website, but there's always the option to just send an email to a journal editor with a pre-submission inquiry like that, or just an informal request. The idea of a pre-submission inquiry is, well, it saves you time, right? Because if the editor says, well, no, I don't think it's a good fit, well, you save yourself some work. What I said earlier, formatting the article for that exact journal, as every journal has different requirements. You may like need to cut down words here, you may change the format, etc., etc. All right. So to answer that question, to answer Sarah's question, should you send one then? Like, is it worth sending one before submitting an article? And my opinion on this is, my view on this is that in most cases, actually pre-submission inquiries are probably not needed. And the reason for that is, and I've heard this from journal editors, from several editors who have told me, well, based on those pre-submission inquiries, I can't anyway not judge whether the paper is a good fit or not. Unless I would say the paper is really far out of scope of what they would normally publish, they're probably like, unless it's super far off, I think most of them will probably ask you to submit the paper anyway because they want to see the whole paper in order to judge. This is what I heard from journal editors personally. Um, and I think also in most of those cases, then, well, you can probably judge yourself. You probably know whether your paper is really far afield for that journal or not by, well, reading their scope of and aims section, right? Like read what the paper says, the journal says themselves, what they want to publish. Um, you'll get some information and you can probably judge to some extent whether your paper is a good fit or not. And if you're still not sure, then reading some papers in that journal, you'll probably get this like broad idea. And when you're not sure, well, once you've done these things, then probably the journal editor also doesn't know. Which means that in those cases, well, then you have more work rather than less work because you also need to kind of write a pre-submission inquiry and you make sure that that inquiry is like written well. And if you just think back, well, how much time does it normally take me to write an abstract? How much like back and forth are we doing with co-authors on that until it's like perfect? Well, there you go, right? You will probably do the same with the pre-submission inquiry, and that is like a lot of work in itself as well. Um, but Sarah, I also don't know your exact situation. Um, and I'm just going to give you now the example that our member, the member of the Researchers Writing Academy, who asked us the same, Emma and me, the same question. Emma being our writing coach, Emma and me are hosting calls in our program where we answer questions like these. Um, and the member we were talking to, well, she was in a very interdisciplinary field and a very new field. Um, she had this like new and innovative approach to her research question. So she honestly really was wondering, well, is this something the journal would be interested in? Like it was kind of unclear based on the papers that were in the journal and based on the scope and aims. It was unclear if the journal would be interested to maybe consider going in a bit of a different direction, to going a bit on a tangent especially because she was in a new field. Um, yeah, for her, it was just truly hard to decide, is this a right fit or not? And I think in cases like this, a pre-submission inquiry can indeed be very helpful because that may save you time. Because if you're really unsure which journal will take my paper, and you just waste time submitting and reformatting and resubmitting, waiting for decisions and stuff, I think in that case, we did actually recommend her to write a pre-submission inquiry. And the other advantage of actually writing one, if you decide to do so, and this is something that I learned from Dr. Emma Billington, a little hack. um, when you then later, like when you submit a pre-submission inquiry, or when you write one and the editor gets back to you, yes, please submit your article. Like, we want to see that article and consider it. As you then write your cover letter to the article, when you're ready to submit your paper, you can reference in that cover letter that maybe the same journal editor or another editor on the journal board, invited you to make the submission. And that just carries a little bit more trust, I think. So that's just a little a nice hack. In summary, really, I would only write pre-submission inquiries for really top tier journals, for a bit higher journals, higher impact factor journals, or if you, well, have a very new approach and there's no like immediate harm, like no obvious harm for your research paper, then I think a pre-submission inquiry is actually a good thing. All right, Sarah. Well, I hope this answered your question, and that was hopefully a bit of helpful info for everyone else as well. Yeah, thanks so much for listening to the very end. Been fun talking to you as always, and talk to you all soon. Bye. If you would like to submit a question for me to answer on the podcast, please head to researcherswritingpodcast.com/question. That's researcherswritingpodcast in one word.com/question. And if you enjoyed this podcast episode, it would really mean the world to me if you could review it in your favorite platform, whether that's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or whichever app you're using. The more reviews a show has, the more likely it will be shown to others who are looking for podcasts in the academic writing space. So thank you.